All right, welcome to your personalized deep dive.
Very excited.
You asked for a neutral look at what Donald Trump did in his first term,
Right.
how those actions affected different people and groups, and then
Yeah.
what all that might mean for the U.S. moving forward.
Big topic.
Huge.
Yeah.
So we're diving into
A very important time.
a pretty intense period in
Yeah,
American history.
Absolutely.
But, you know, understanding it is so important
Oh, for sure.
if you want to be
Especially today.
an informed citizen.
Yes.
And going through all this research,
Yeah.
articles, and policy analysis, I mean, even some historical comparisons.
Interesting.
We found some pretty surprising stuff.
It is fascinating to see how much ground we're covering here.
Yeah.
Immigration, the economy, healthcare.
Right?
Even those promises Trump made during his campaign and whether he kept them.
Yeah,
It's a lot to unpack.
it is.
But I think we can make sense of it together.
Totally. And you know what really jumped out at me?
What's that?
The sheer volume of changes to immigration policy.
Oh, wow.
Over 470 administrative changes in just 4 years.
Really?
That's
Wow.
unprecedented.
That's a stark contrast to previous presidencies, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
It suggests a deliberate effort to reshape the immigration system from top to bottom.
Right. And think about the travel ban.
Yeah.
Targeting those Muslim-majority countries was instantly controversial. The administration called it a national security measure,
Right.
but critics saw it as blatant discrimination.
It definitely ignited a debate about the balance between national security and religious freedom.
Right.
And we can't forget the border wall.
Oh, yeah.
That was a signature issue for Trump during his campaign.
Huge.
He promised to build hundreds of miles, and he did make significant progress.
Right.
But whether it's actually effective at deterring illegal immigration is still up for debate.
Yeah, the border wall is a great example of how Trump's policies often had,
Mixed results.
mixed results and were incredibly divisive. And then there's the Remain in Mexico policy, which basically forced asylum seekers to stay in Mexico
Right.
while waiting for their cases to be heard in the U.S.
Yeah, I remember that.
This resulted in huge camps forming just south of the border with people living in precarious conditions.
It's a policy that really underscores the human impact of these changes.
Yeah,
Imagine being forced to flee your home country,
right.
seeking safety in the U.S., only to be stuck in limbo, often in dangerous circumstances.
Okay, so we've talked about the changes, but what about the overall impact?
Right.
These immigration policies didn't affect everyone equally, right?
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
These policies disproportionately impacted immigrants from Latin America, the Middle East, and African countries.
So certain groups were definitely,
Hit harder than others.
hit harder.
Some argued that these measures were crucial for national security, while others viewed them as discriminatory and harmful.
Right.
It's important to consider both sides of the argument to fully understand the complex landscape of this issue.
Absolutely. All right, let's shift gears and talk about the economy and taxes.
Okay.
One big change that stands out is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or TCJA for short.
Yeah, the TCJA.
This was a massive overhaul of the tax code, and one of the most significant things it did was slash the corporate tax rate from 35% all the way down to 21%.
A big cut.
Huge.
Trump's reasoning was that this would boost the economy by allowing businesses to invest more and create jobs. It's a classic supply-side economics approach.
Okay.
The idea being that benefits to corporations will eventually trickle down to everyone else.
But did it actually work that way?
Well,
The impact of the TCJA is a pretty hot topic.
it is a hot topic.
Corporations and wealthy Americans certainly saw immediate benefits, but
Right.
there's a lot of debate about whether those benefits trickled down to lower income groups.
Yeah, a lot of debate.
Some economists argue that it actually widened the gap between the rich and the poor.
That's a key point.
Okay.
While some families might have seen a small decrease in their tax burden, many others saw little to no benefit.
And on top of that, the TCJA significantly increased the federal deficit.
You can't forget about that.
So,
It's a mixed bag.
definitely.
And we can't forget about deregulation.
Oh, yeah. Deregulation.
Trump made it very clear that he wanted to cut back on government regulations, arguing they were holding businesses back. He rolled back rules in a ton of different areas, from environmental protection to financial regulations.
So like a lot of Obama-era stuff.
This was a core part of his economic agenda.
Okay.
He believed that cutting regulations would unleash economic growth and give businesses more freedom to operate.
But of course, there's another side to that coin.
Right.
Some people argue that those regulations were in place for a reason. to protect the environment, to ensure consumer safety, to prevent another financial crisis.
All important things.
Yeah.
Rolling them back could have some pretty serious unintended consequences down the line.
Yeah, and this debate is still raging today.
It's a classic debate between those who prioritize economic growth and those who emphasize the importance of regulations for protecting people and the planet.
Right, and it's a debate that's still very much alive today.
Absolutely. And now let's turn our attention to healthcare.
Okay.
One of Trump's biggest goals was to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare.
Obamacare, yeah.
He tried repeatedly to repeal it entirely, but ultimately fell short.
He did manage to get rid of the individual mandate, though.
Right, the individual mandate.
That was the part of the ACA that required most people to have health insurance or face a penalty.
And the administration also promoted these short-term health plans, which are cheaper but offer much less comprehensive coverage.
So these short-term plans were
kind of a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah.
This sparked a heated debate about whether these plans were truly affordable or actually left people vulnerable to high medical bills if they got seriously ill.
Yeah, if you got really sick, you were in trouble.
Right.
And how did all of these changes affect everyday Americans, especially those who relied on the Affordable Care Act for their health insurance?
Well, it had a significant impact, especially for those with low and middle incomes.
So the people who needed it most
Exactly.
got hurt the most.
Many people who were previously getting subsidies to help them afford coverage under the ACA found themselves struggling to pay for their health care.
And I'm guessing that the availability of affordable plans
Went down
decreased.
in many parts of the country.
So even though a full repeal of Obamacare didn't happen, Trump's actions still had a major impact on the healthcare landscape.
Absolutely. It reshaped the healthcare system in significant ways, and the effects of those changes continue to be felt today.
So it was a big deal.
A very big deal.
Okay, so we've covered immigration, the economy, taxes, healthcare.
There's a lot of ground.
I know.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to unpack.
Oh, yeah, we're just getting started.
We haven't even touched on trade policy, foreign policy, or all those campaign promises Trump made.
We'll get there.
And you know what I'm really curious about? How all of these changes actually played out in people's lives.
Yeah, we've been talking about some pretty big policy shifts. But what I find particularly important is how these changes actually played out in people's lives.
Right. It's one thing to understand the laws and the regulations, but it's another to see how they affect different communities.
Exactly. And one of the things that a lot of people pointed out was how Trump's policies seemed to disproportionately impact racial minorities.
That's a really important point. We'll dive into that more in just a bit.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
Right.
You're bringing up a really important point.
Yeah.
When you look at those immigration restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
the travel ban, the border wall, the changes to asylum procedures,
Right.
it's hard to ignore the fact that they primarily affected people of color.
And while the administration argued that these policies were colorblind and focused solely on national security,
Right.
many critics saw them as discriminatory and argued that they fueled racial tensions across the country.
It's definitely something worth thinking about. How policies, even if they're not explicitly written to target specific groups,
Yeah,
can have uneven impacts on different communities.
absolutely.
And speaking of uneven impacts, we can't overlook the potential consequences of Trump's healthcare rollbacks on women,
Right.
particularly when it comes to access to reproductive health care.
That's right. This was a very contentious issue throughout Trump's presidency.
Oh, absolutely.
And his administration took several steps to restrict access to abortion and other reproductive health services.
Mm-hmm.
This was met with strong opposition from pro-choice groups,
Of course.
while anti-abortion groups praised the moves.
Right, so very divisive.
Very much so.
It's a complex issue with strong feelings on both sides, and it definitely highlights how policy changes can have a very real impact on people's lives and their personal choices.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of choices, let's not forget about the economic consequences of some of Trump's policies.
Right.
While the corporate tax cuts were touted as a boon for the economy, some argue that they primarily benefited wealthy Americans.
Right, the trickle-down effect that didn't quite trickle down.
Yeah, and actually widened the gap between the rich and the poor.
That's a major concern.
Okay.
If the economic benefits of these policies are primarily concentrated at the top,
Yeah.
it could lead to greater income inequality and potentially destabilize the economy over the long term.
So where does all of this leave us?
Well,
If these trends were to continue,
Yeah.
what might the future hold for the U.S.? I have to admit, it's a little unsettling to think about.
It's certainly something to consider. We need to examine the potential consequences of staying on the path set by these policies.
Okay, so let's do that.
Okay.
Let's say, for example, these trends continue.
Right.
What could that mean for the U.S.?
Well, for instance, let's look at the economic landscape we've already talked about. Inequality.
Right.
But there's also the looming threat of a federal deficit crisis.
Right. Those tax cuts didn't exactly pay for themselves.
Nope.
And the national debt has been ballooning.
And then there are the potential environmental risks associated with all that deregulation.
Right.
We've already seen pushback against rollbacks of environmental protections, and that's likely to continue.
And from a social policy perspective,
Yeah.
there's a concern that continuing down this path could exacerbate the cultural divides in the U.S., leading to increased social unrest.
Definitely a concern.
And we've already seen how tensions around immigration and racial justice have been heightened in recent years.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to grapple with. And on the foreign policy front, Trump's America First approach represented a significant shift.
a big shift.
And it had ripple effects around the world.
For sure.
If that trend were to continue, it could lead to a decline in American influence on the global stage and potentially even damage relationships with key allies.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
There's also the economic fallout from those trade wars to consider.
Right.
Tariffs might benefit some domestic industries in the short term, but they can also lead to higher prices for consumers and retaliation from other countries, hurting American businesses in the process.
It's a delicate balance.
Okay, so we've outlined some potential downsides, but here's where I need your expertise.
Okay, shoot.
Some people argue that continuing down this path could actually undermine American democracy,
Interesting.
maybe even leading to a more illiberal form of government or even authoritarian populism. Is that a real possibility, or is that just fear-mongering?
It's not about predicting the future, but it's important to understand the potential risks.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Okay.
What are those risks?
When we talk about illiberal democracy, we're talking about a system where elections still take place,
Okay.
but individual rights and freedoms are restricted, and the rule of law is weakened, in essence. The democratic process becomes a facade for a system that is less free and less fair.
So you could have someone get elected,
Right.
but then they start dismantling the guardrails of democracy and chipping away at the institutions that are supposed to hold them accountable.
Exactly. And there are some warning signs to watch out for.
Like what?
For example, continued legal changes and gerrymandering could suppress voting rights,
Okay.
making it harder for certain groups to have their voices heard in the political process.
And we could see restrictions on civil rights, especially for marginalized groups who already face discrimination.
That's right.
And then if we move further down the spectrum, there's the possibility of a slide toward authoritarian populism.
Right.
This is where a leader comes to power by appealing to popular sentiment, but then concentrates power within the executive branch, often at the expense of checks and balances.
Yeah, that's the danger. One of the hallmarks of authoritarian populism is the polarization of society and the demonization of political opponents.
Okay.
Instead of healthy debate and disagreement,
Right.
you get an us versus them mentality,
Us versus them.
where anyone who criticizes the leader is labeled an enemy of the people.
It sounds like a pretty scary scenario.
It can be.
And it's not hard to see how some of the trends we've been discussing could contribute to that kind of environment.
Unfortunately, that's true.
But let's get even more specific. If we were to imagine a future where these policies continue, who would likely suffer the most and who might actually benefit?
It's a difficult question to answer, but we have to be honest about the potential consequences.
Let's be honest.
Based on what we've observed, it's likely that low-income and working-class Americans would face some of the biggest challenges.
Okay.
They often bear the brunt of cuts to social programs and changes to labor laws.
That makes sense. And sadly, racial and ethnic minorities are also likely to be disproportionately impacted.
Right.
We've talked about the potential effects of immigration policies, but there's also the risk of increased discrimination and reduced access to opportunities in areas like education, employment, and housing.
And we can't forget about the LGBTQ+ community.
Oh, right, of course.
Rollbacks of protections could make them more vulnerable to discrimination and hate crimes.
And tragically, women, especially those seeking reproductive health care, could face even greater barriers to accessing the care they need.
So it's a sobering thought.
It is.
These are just some of the groups that could be negatively impacted. It paints a rather bleak picture,
Yeah.
but we have to acknowledge these potential consequences if we want to avoid them. On the flip side, who might benefit from a continuation of these policies?
That's a good question. It seems like there are always winners and losers when it comes to policy changes.
Right, and based on the patterns we've observed, it's likely that high-income earners and corporations would continue to see advantages, particularly through favorable tax policies and a deregulated business environment.
Okay.
This could further concentrate wealth and power at the top, potentially widening the gap between the haves and have-nots.
So the rich get richer and those who are already struggling fall further behind.
That's a real possibility, and there are certain segments of the electorate that would likely continue to support these policies, those who align with a conservative agenda and prioritize issues like traditional values, law and order, limited government intervention, and a strong national defense.
Okay, so we've laid out some potential downsides and we've talked about who might benefit, but let's get really real here. Are we actually talking about a potential dystopian future for the U.S.? I mean, is that even possible in a country with such a long history of democracy and a system of checks and balances?
It's not my place to make predictions, but we have to be aware of the potential risks. When we think about a dystopian future, we often imagine a breakdown of societal structures, rampant inequality, and the suppression of individual rights.
So not exactly a happy place.
Not at all.
But could that really happen here in the U.S.? It's hard to imagine.
It's certainly not inevitable, but it's not impossible either. The U.S. has a strong democratic foundation, but that doesn't mean it's immune to the forces that have eroded democracy in other parts of the world. If we see a continued erosion of democratic norms, a weakening of institutions, and a rise in authoritarian tendencies, the path toward a more dystopian scenario becomes more plausible.
Okay, that's officially unsettling.
I understand.
But let's say those trends do continue. What can ordinary citizens do to push back? Do we just sit back and watch it all unfold, or is there something we can do to resist?
Absolutely not. There are ways to resist authoritarian trends, even when they seem overwhelming. It starts with civic engagement.
Okay.
Voting in every election, supporting candidates who champion democratic values, and advocating for policies that protect individual rights are all crucial.
So don't underestimate the power of the ballot box.
Exactly. And beyond voting, we can't forget about the power of peaceful protests and activism. When people come together and raise their voices, it can force those in power to listen. History is full of examples of movements that have achieved significant change through peaceful protest.
Right, there's strength in numbers. But what happens when those in power threaten to use force against protesters? We've seen that happen in other countries and sometimes even here in the U.S. How do you resist in those situations?
That's when it becomes even more important to rely on nonviolent resistance strategies.
Okay.
Maintaining a commitment to peaceful protest is essential, both for moral reasons and for maintaining public support. It's about finding ways to resist oppression without resorting to violence, which often backfires and can be used to justify further crackdowns.
So even when faced with aggression, you're saying it's important to stay committed to nonviolence.
It's not about being passive, but about being strategic. There are many ways to resist injustice without using violence, and history is full of examples of movements that have succeeded through nonviolent means.
I'm starting to feel a glimmer of hope here, but where does a regular person even begin? It all feels so big and overwhelming. What can one person actually do to make a difference?
You can start small. Educate yourself about the warning signs of authoritarianism and the strategies for resisting it. There are many resources available online, and in libraries, support organizations that are fighting for civil liberties and democratic values. Get involved in your local community, build connections with like-minded individuals, and make your voice heard.
So you're saying that even small actions can have a ripple effect?
Absolutely. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to a larger movement for change. And remember, dystopia is not inevitable. It's a warning, not a prophecy. The future is not set in stone. We have the power to shape it.
That's actually pretty inspiring. You've given me a lot to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power, and an informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny.
That's a great takeaway for our listeners. And on that note, we'll wrap up this intense but crucial deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and consider how you can participate in shaping the future you want to see.
Remember, the choices we make today will determine the world we live in tomorrow. So stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.
Until next time, keep diving deep. Okay, so you're saying it's not too late.
No, not at all.
We can still fight back against these trends and protect our democracy, but it's hard to know where to even start.
It can feel overwhelming, for sure.
Yeah.
But there are concrete things you can do. I always think about it in terms of layers. First, we need to be aware of the threat, like we're doing right now. understanding how seemingly small changes can add up to something much bigger.
Knowledge is power, as they say. But then what does everyone need to become a political activist overnight?
Not necessarily start with the basics. Are you registered to vote?
Hmm.
Do the voting rules in your state and any upcoming local elections? That's the foundation of functioning democracy.
Right. If you don't vote, you can't really complain about the outcome.
Exactly. And beyond voting, consider supporting candidates who align with your values, donate to their campaigns, volunteer your time. Every little bit helps.
So getting involved at the local level is key.
Absolutely. Local elections often have a more direct impact on your daily life than national ones. Plus, getting involved locally is a great way to build connections and learn the ropes of political organizing.
That makes sense. But what about those bigger issues we talked about, the potential for restrictions on civil rights, the erosion of democratic norms? Can regular people really do anything about those?
They absolutely can. Supporting organizations that are fighting for civil liberties and democratic values is crucial. These groups often rely on grassroots support to challenge unjust laws, hold those in power accountable, and educate the public about these issues.
So even if you're not on the front lines protesting, you can still make a difference by supporting the groups that are.
Precisely. And don't underestimate the power of your voice speaking out against injustice, whether it's through social media, writing letters to your elected officials, or simply talking to friends and family, can help shift public opinion and create momentum for change.
It's about raising awareness and making sure these issues don't get swept under the rug.
Exactly. And if you're feeling more ambitious, you can get involved in peaceful protests and demonstrations throughout history. Mass movements have played a vital role in challenging oppressive regimes and demanding change.
Protesting can be risky, though, especially if those in power are willing to use force against dissent.
That's true, and it's important to prioritize your safety and know your rights when participating in any form of protest. Organizations that specialize in nonviolent resistance often provide training and support to ensure that protests remain peaceful and effective.
So there are ways to make your voice heard without putting yourself in unnecessary danger.
Absolutely. And remember, resistance isn't just about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It's about the everyday choices we make, the information we consume, the companies we support, the conversations we have.
It's about being conscious of the power we have as individuals and using that power to create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And one more thing I wanted to mention, supporting independent media and fact-checking organizations is crucial in this age of misinformation and propaganda. These organizations play a vital role in holding those in power accountable and ensuring that the public has access to accurate information.
So being a critical consumer of information is part of being an engaged citizen.
Absolutely. Don't just believe everything you read or hear. Check your sources. Be skeptical of claims that seem too good to be true, and support outlets that are committed to journalistic integrity.
It's about taking responsibility for our own information intake and not letting ourselves be manipulated by those who would seek to divide us.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to do everything all at once. Start with one small action, then another and another. Every step you take, no matter how small, contributes to a larger movement for positive change.
It's about finding your own way to participate in the fight for a better future.
Exactly. And that's really the key takeaway from all of this.
Yeah.
Yes, there are some concerning trends that we need to be aware of, but we don't have to succumb to fear or despair. We have agency, we have power, and we have a responsibility to shape the world we want to live in.
Wow, you've really given me, and I'm sure our listener as well, a lot to think about. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power, and hope is a form of resistance.
That's a great message to end on. And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this intense but incredibly important deep dive. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics, find your own ways to engage, and remember that even small actions can make a big difference. Until next time, keep diving deep.